Janine and Bill, good to see you. All right, well, let's go ahead and get started because we have a wonderful program for you today. So hello, I'm Laura McWhorter. I'm the Chief Philanthropy Officer here at the North Texas Community Foundation. And we're just so pleased that you are joining us for this program. Before I hand it over to Vicki Andrews, our Director of Donor Relations, we just want to take care of a little bit of housekeeping. We kindly ask that everyone please keep yourself on mute to ensure that we can hear our speakers and that we maintain good sound quality. Also, we're going to be utilizing the chat function today. So throughout our program, if you have questions, feel free to please submit those. You'll see the chat bubble on the bottom of your screen. And I'm going to be monitoring that throughout the program. So you don't have to wait. Just go ahead and put your questions there. And at the end, we'll be able to ask those of our speaker, Phil. We're going to make this interactive today. So we have a couple of polls throughout the program. So get ready for those. Don't worry, we'll cue you when that time comes, but get ready to register your answers. And then next, I just want to disclose we are recording this event. We will put this on our website, and we're also going to send it out to all of you to share with your friends after the event. So finally, just want to say a quick thank you to the meeting squad, Carlo Capua and Bill Alexi, who is at the controls today, making sure our technology runs smoothly. And just thank you so much for your support of our Insights series. So with that, let's get to the program. So Vicki, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. We are so pleased. Let me unmute. Thank you. We're so pleased to see so many of our close friends on this call with us, as well as some new friends today. Welcome and thank you for spending an hour with us today to talk more about philanthropy. Our mission at the Community Foundation is to make this a thriving and wonderful place to live. And one way we aim to do that is through our education of the needs of the community and how we can better help. And so that's one of the reasons why we've brought an expert to help us work towards that in a more effective way. We have such a generous and caring community, and you'll hear more about that today, as well as some ways that we can possibly improve how we're approaching philanthropy. So like Laura said, we'd like to get everyone interacting with us on the Zoom call. So get ready to take a quick poll. I'm going to ask you about your knowledge of nonprofits in Tarrant County. Get closer to your keyboard so you can participate. If you don't see the poll options on your screen, just simply type your answer into the chat feature and we'll be able to count it. So the question is, how many active, verified 501c3 nonprofits are in Tarrant County? Do you think there are about 3,500, maybe 5,500? Or do you think there are over 6,900 nonprofits in Tarrant County? Think about all the nonprofits that you give money to or that you hear about. Go ahead and make your selection. 3,500, 5,500, or 6,900. I'll give you just a few seconds to answer that, and then we'll give you the poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Poll is closed. So you guys are smart. And you're right. We have 6,962 verified active nonprofits in Tarrant County right now. And that's a whole lot of nonprofits. And that shows you how important it is for our grants to show impact. And investing for impact is what we're here to talk to you about today. So I'd like to introduce you to the CEO of the North Texas Community Foundation, Rose Bradshaw, and our very special guest, Bill Buchanan.
Thanks, Vicki.
Yeah. Rose, you're muted.
Okay, there we go, unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Well, welcome to all of you for joining us today. Thank you so much. I'm glad you didn't have to brave the weather for us to be together. And Phil, we had originally intended for you to join us here in person, but we certainly are glad now that to have you here with us today. It was about a year ago, I think, that when our team first got a hold of your book. Of course, we've been tracking your work at the Center for Effective Philanthropy for years, but this book really was so powerful, and we really wanted to make sure that all of our donors here in Fort Worth and close friends had the chance to visit with you. So we're looking forward to a thought-provoking conversation. Let's kick this off by taking a look at the numbers once more. Vicki was looking at the number of nonprofits, but let's look at the numbers in charitable giving for 2019. So you'll see here, every year Giving USA calculates the amount of charitable donations that are made in the United States. And in 2019, we hit an all-time high of 450 billion. It's interesting to note that the lion's share of that funding comes from individuals. So that's an awful lot of money going out the door. And it's critical that it's being invested wisely. Phil, in your book, you talk about the 4 keys to effective philanthropy. Can you walk us through those?
Sure. And let me just start off by saying I'm really happy to be with all of you. Grateful to Laura, Vicki, you, Rose, all the staff at North Texas Community Foundation, and happy to be talking about giving at a time when giving is just so vitally important. Nonprofits play a role in this country that I think is often underappreciated. It's distinct and different than the really vital role that business plays and the role that government plays. And nonprofits are often, taking on the toughest challenges. And so as a giver, it's hard to know where to even begin. And when I say, in answer to your question, Rose, that it really being an effective giver requires 4 elements, and then I tell you what they are, you'll roll your eyes and say, well, of course, that's what it takes to be effective in anything. But on each dimension, it's much tougher in philanthropy than it is in other domains. So let me explain what I mean. The first thing is just clear goals. But how do you choose your goals? When there are so many competing interests, so many requests, so many real needs to be met. The second dimension is strategy. So if goals are the what are you trying to do, strategy is simply the how are you trying to do it. Here again, you might say, well, that's what you need to be effective in business too. And sure enough, except strategy plays out completely differently in this world of nonprofits and philanthropy than it does in the world of investing in business. And the reason why is that in business, like when I worked as a strategy consultant many years ago, it was all about competitive positioning, unique positioning in a zero-sum competitive environment. Whereas in the world of philanthropy and nonprofits, strategies have to be shared. It's not about what is Uber's market share relative to Lyft's. It's about how does the homeless shelter work with the drug treatment and prevention organization collaboratively to make sure folks have what they need. The third dimension, of course, is just implementation. How do you get it done? Here again, the challenges are distinct and different, and we can get into this later, in part because of the power dynamics between the funder and the funded. And then the fourth, and maybe the trickiest of all, is performance indicators. The how do you know whether you're making a difference? And that's tricky because there is no analog to profit or return on investment, no one metric by which we can assess very different organizations. So I think it's about goals, strategies, implementation, indicators, or if you want to say it more plainly, what am I trying to do? How am I trying to do it? How specifically are we getting it done? And then how do we know? And on each of those dimensions, the dynamics are very different in the world of philanthropy and nonprofits than they are, say, in the business world.
Okay, so let's unpack that. You
Okay.
shared a lot of information there. And if we think about goals, you make me think of an incredibly charitable former board of directors chair of mine who was laser focused on education. He was really challenged because there were so many others that would approach him for support. And he wanted to be, a good friend, good neighbor, cheer them on. But he found it was really challenging for him to be able to just be comfortable saying no. So when people have identified a goal, how do they stay on that goal and make sure they're not getting thrown off track or starting to drift?
It's so tough. Focus is really important. And at the same time, it's also important not to be so focused that you lose sight of the connection between issues. So I think if you want to focus on education, that's great. But you may also have to sometimes look up at what are the connections between poverty and educational outcomes. And yes, maybe I can remain focused on education, but with an awareness of the related philanthropy focused on, issues of poverty that might also relate to educational outcomes. I mean, I think one of the most important things a wise donor can do is say no, right? That if you simply respond to all of the requests, you will look back at the end of the year and your giving won't really look like your priorities. It will just look like what you responded to. At the same time, we have to be realistic that you got to set aside some amount of your giving to be responsive, because when your niece comes to you and says, she's raising money for her school project, you're going to say yes, right? And so you have to have a budget for that. And of course, unexpected things happen, as we have seen in 2020. And so it's important also to be open to responding to the unexpected with generosity. So it's a balancing act, and there's no way of knowing if you're getting it exactly right.
Well, actually, you make me think of another fund holder who has his big, hairy, audacious goal, and it's big, and he's going for it. He also reserves a certain amount of funding for what he calls encouragement grants. And it's for those things that he wants to encourage others, in their pursuits. But it's a defined percentage of his giving, and he doesn't really stray from that.
Can I say one more thing about this,
Sure.
Rose? Just to illustrate it, because sometimes this can be a little abstract. Let's look at the biggest giver of them all, Bill Gates, right? When he first got into the global health work that he was doing, he was very clear that he was not interested in global development, that it was about vaccinations and immunizations, and that he wasn't going to get pulled into other domains. But over time, he realized that he literally couldn't achieve his goals in global health without working on global development. That you can't get vaccines to people when there aren't roads, right? And that's an oversimplification of his evolution. But at the same time, the foundation has remained relatively focused for a foundation of that size. But there is such a thing as being too focused, as well as obviously not focused enough. But go ahead.
Sure. No, that actually makes me think of another key element you mentioned was collaboration.
Yeah.
And so locally, I know the Tarrant To and Through collaborative that's working on ensuring that students have a pathway to economic success through education, starting in 7th grade and rolling all the way through community college or certifications. Huge effort. But I think that in that element, we were focused on education, recognizing that we also needed flexible resources when kids get a flat tire or, kind of the wheels fall off and they need support just to keep going. I hear you on that. And as far as indicators are concerned, so this is a challenge, right? Because we never have perfect information.
Right. And
we also want to be able to ask the nonprofits that they communicate what they're accomplishing and they're staying on target. So can you walk us through how to come to agreement on what those indicators should be? And then what's the most successful examples you might share about ways in which keeping track of those indicators helped to not only achieve the goal, but maybe then even go beyond it?
Yeah. Well, one of the mistakes that I think donors often make is imposing indicators sort of from the top down, as opposed to engaging the nonprofit in a conversation about how will you define success? What metrics do you look to? And another mistake I think donors sometimes make is to look for the simple measure that cuts across very different organizations and contexts. So in the book, I write about, in the first chapter, two nonprofits that I think are exemplary in various ways. They both happen to be located in Massachusetts. And I'll just use them as an illustration for how different the measurement or performance indicator question, can be. So first one is called Bell Excel, and they focus on the issue of summer learning loss, which is it's the backsliding that every student experiences in the summer, but that low-income students experience in a more pronounced way. Their objective was to create effective summer programs that would counteract the academic backsliding for low-income students so that they would have greater academic success in the future. So that's a real tough goal. And if that's their goal, they better darn well measure it and know whether whether they're making progress toward it, especially if they wanted to do what they wanted to do, which was rapidly expand it because they thought it was effective. So they literally, went through $1 million plus randomized control trials in which the academic outcomes of students who participated in the Bell Excel program were compared against those who looked similarly demographically, but did not participate. They saw that their program was effective, and they have been seeking to scale it widely. Another nonprofit, also in Massachusetts, but locally focused, UTech, working with gang-involved young people to recruit them out of gang life, get them employed at one of their social enterprises, a mattress recycling facility, a wood shop that makes cutting boards and sells them to Whole Foods, and a cafe. They recruit these young people out of gang life at the places where those young people are most open to change. And where is that? It's funerals of their friends. It's at jail visits. It's at hospital bedsides after someone's been shot but not killed. Well, they are locally focused, and they have the resources to work to try to reach every gang-involved young person. So they were asked by a funder, would you do a randomized control trial? Well, what would that mean for them? That would mean literally not serving young people and putting their lives at risk, right? So they said, absolutely, we will not. But they still rigorously measure recidivism rates, and they compare those recidivism rates to state and national averages. So an RCT wasn't right for them. And then compare those two organizations to a third, the Children's Museum. Is the Children's Museum saving lives? No. Are they affecting the life trajectory of people such that their lives look different at age 25 than they would have otherwise had they not visited the Children's Museum 6 times when they were a kid? Of course not. Of course not. Should they still be measuring their effectiveness? Absolutely. But the measures are going to look really different. It might be based on things like surveys of families that came to the Children's Museum. What was the experience like for them? They might look at demographic data of who they're serving to make sure it's not just the affluent kids. So it's very dangerous to try to reduce these very different goals to one measure, whether that be overhead rate, which doesn't tell you that much, or some other metric that it's very tempting because people are looking for that analog to ROI. They want to assess their philanthropy same way they are able to call up their 401k and see how they're doing. It's just not possible. That doesn't mean assessment's not really important. It is. It's just more difficult.
Yeah, it is more difficult. And I would argue that every trip to a museum for me is life-changing and enriching.
Okay, fair enough for us.
So I'll beg to differ on that one.
Okay.
But you make me think about actually another local example here. Our friends Garland and Molly Lassiter started this program called Ntxcf. Incredible program helping children from low-income families spend a summer, believe it or not, actually 3 summers up in Aspen, 3 consecutive summers up in Aspen, focusing on STEM.
Mhm.
And they are focused on the indicators. And when they are not seeing the progress they want to see, they alter, they make the refinements to the program. And I know we have the Wells are on with us. They're investors in that effort, a number of other fund holders. But we've clearly seen that the Lassiter's kind of laser focus on those indicators has helped a lot. It does also make me think about when you're establishing those indicators, you've got to have a really trusted relationship, right? I think that trust piece, we saw it in yesterday's article in the Wall Street Journal, in the conversation about the Fairbairns and the Fidelity having a fundamental miscommunication that resulted in the lack of execution, just poorly executed in the end because at the start, there wasn't clear communication. What's your thought on that, just as far as the trust and role between the donor and the nonprofit or the institution they're working with?
Yeah, I mean, trust is so vital. Community foundations are such a key trusted partner in communities, right? Bridging donors who want to make a difference, but might not know where to go, right? With nonprofits who the community foundation knows, and making those connections. And that's so crucial. The donor nonprofit relationship, is tricky. We do a lot to try to help big foundations and community foundations get feedback from nonprofits through a comparative assessment tool that we have. And people will say, hey, Phil, we want to do that customer survey you have. I'm like, what do you mean customer? Well, the nonprofits, the grantees, they're like our customers. No, they're not. The money's flowing in the opposite direction. And as a result, the power dynamics are completely different. So I tell the story in the book which is a true story, about going to eat at this fancy restaurant with my family in Harvard Square and seeing mice everywhere. And my 7-year-old daughter, was basically, fully apoplectic. And my 11-year-old daughter was trying to chill her out. And, we had this terrible experience at this restaurant because the staff were like, oh, it's not so bad. It's just a few mice. We had an outdoor event, earlier. I'm like, what are you talking about? And so, what did I do when I got home? Like any good, red-blooded American, I trashed them online everywhere I could find, right? And said, don't go back. Now, if I have a negative interaction with a donor as a nonprofit leader, and I think they've got significant capacity to support my organization, and they treat me really poorly, I'm not going to trash them anywhere, right? The power dynamics are just really different. And so trust is vital. And recognizing those power dynamics and making it possible for folks to have open conversations. Because I think one of the mistakes that happens is in philanthropy is that we can overestimate our own ability as donors to understand what others need, rather than letting them tell us what they need. People are the best experts on their own lives. And so some of the most spectacular sort of philanthropic failures have been where a solution was arrived at by donors, but the people who were intended to benefit didn't actually think it was the solution. And some of the best successes are the inverse, where people closest to the issues and problems and challenges, or people experiencing those problems, were really heard and were brought into the process of shaping the strategies that were ultimately supported philanthropically.
Sure. And I know you talk about this in the book, but actually the same anecdote you use here, someone had told me years ago, 30 years ago, when I came into the field, And my mentor said to me, well, Rose, now that you're in philanthropy, your jokes are really funny. You're brilliant, and you've had your last bad meal.
Right.
And he said
Right.
that, the dynamics have changed as soon as you walk in the room. So then you have to think about how do you create a environment where you can really have an honest conversation. And I know that's prompted by asking those good questions, right? I think in the book, you tease out some good questions to be able to get to the heart of the matter when you're speaking with your grantee. What were a couple of those?
Well, I mean, part of it is like literally just having the conversation, what do you most need? What can I do differently to support you? What is your biggest frustration? What's your biggest frustration with donors? Asking those questions, creating a space in which a nonprofit leader says, oh boy, I can actually talk to this person, I think can be really powerful. And look, I don't want to take anything. I mean, I think that there are a lot of donors who do this really, really well. And also, like, to your point, it is hard because people are not as honest with you as they would otherwise be. And even if you don't want that to be the case, and I think most people do not want that to be the case, it's hard to mitigate, those dynamics. And the reason it matters is not so everybody feels good. It's so that you have good information, right? So that you really know what's going on and can learn and adapt.
Sure. You make me think of a change that was made in our grant reporting system. And it was really to come away from what changed over the course of the grant cycle. What have you learned? And just so that we can make sure that we are opening the door for the grantee to be able to tell us how things have shifted, because no one has a crystal ball. And oftentimes the way that they plan to execute something, they had to adapt. And my goodness, we've seen it in COVID, in spades. And I would love to focus in on difficult choices we're having to make as donors during this time. You've got your pressing needs, and then you have the desire to go to the root causes. So over the past 8 months, our donors have just really stepped up to the plate to address COVID-related needs across the board, whether that be at domestic violence shelters or at the food bank, looking at people who are in fear of eviction, just really a ton of investment going on. And the private foundation stepped up, and just individuals across the region. Right. I would love to actually ask our guests with us today to do another poll. Let's pull up that next poll. And just so we can get a bead on how your own giving has been impacted during this time of COVID. So it's pretty straightforward. First, answer number 1 is I give less. A is I give less. B is I give about the same. And C, I give more. So let's all do that poll and submit it. I'll give you a second to register your answer. Close it in 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's see the answers. Okay, we're giving more. Good. Well, our nonprofits will be happy to hear that. And Phil, I think you will be as well. I know the numbers have really reflected, I think, the philanthropic community standing up at this time. Carlo, let's flip to the slide to look at what Tarrant County's figures are reflecting. So here in Tarrant County, we know our fund holders have directed about just over $4 million in general operating support to address COVID-related needs. This is over and above general giving. They really responded to the call. Our private foundations, this is an underestimate, but for those who have reported back to us, it's well in excess of 10 million from the private foundations. And like that original slide we showed, individuals are outpacing the foundations, corporate foundations, or family foundations. And it's estimated at a low level of 12 million. So you can see the numbers are up. But let's talk, Phil, about that challenge around, especially now, emergency needs versus long-term recovery. How can we think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so tough because both are so important. Both are so important. So I think I'd like to root, my answer to that question in sort of what is the what is the nonprofit experience right now? I saw an article in the Chronicle of Philanthropy today saying for many of the largest nonprofits, giving is up, which is great. So Feeding America, has raised a lot more money this year than last year. That's great. It also doesn't tell us if they've raised enough for the need, right? That's a whole nother question. But what we see in our surveys of nonprofits that aren't just the large ones, right? That are the couple $100,000 budget organizations rooted in communities, is that like when we did a survey of a representative group of nonprofits that receive at least some foundation funding in May, what we saw was 80% were planning to or had already tapped reserves. 62% had or were planning to reduce staff hours, wages, or benefits. Nearly half had already laid off or furloughed employees or were planning to. A majority of nonprofits, and the number was higher for those serving historically disadvantaged populations, the very people who have been hardest hit by COVID, were reporting increased demand at the same time that a majority were also reporting decreases in revenue, especially fee-for-service revenue and revenue from those making smaller gifts, by which I mean like $7,500 or less. So think about that challenge. This is a challenge. I mean, we're all so focused, and we should be, on small businesses and how they're going to fare. Well, for small businesses, at least revenue and demand go together. For nonprofits, it's the twin challenge of increased demand and decreased revenue. So what does this mean for donors? And I think I may get kicked right out of the Zoom for saying this, is that as generous as you've been, I would implore you to dig as deeply as you can, because the organizations that you've historically supported need you. The organizations, to your point, Rose, working on immediate response and relief need you, and the long-term rebuilding needs you. And I know that's hard and easy for me to tell you what to do, but I really believe that this is, I'm 50 years old. I've never seen a moment, in our country that comes close to this, right? And we can talk about all of the suffering, all of the ways in which historic inequities are not just being exposed, but deepened in ways that could last generations. And those of us who have the ability to do something with our money, with our time, I don't believe any of us will look back in 10 or 20 years at this moment and say, I wish I'd done less. I really don't believe that. And so I think, as hard as it is, this is just a time where whatever you plan to do in terms of your giving doesn't meet the realities of today, and it's time to go to the new plan. And it looks like many of your donors are, and that's fantastic.
They really are. And you make me think, Phil, of my father, the greatest generation, my parents, for many others who have relatives that we can recall who really stepped up to the plate, right, in a time of tremendous adversity.
Right.
And we are here because of it. I think you're right. We won't regret what we did today, and the future is sure depending on us. No doubt about that. I also,
Rose,
yes.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Before.
I just was going to, just one line here that really stuck with me from the book, the difference between dependence and dependability, and that those groups that are on the front lines, we need to be able to depend upon them, right? And so they do need that level of consistent general operating support.
That's right. And this is a way in which, giving is not like investing, right? I mean, so like there have been a lot of folks who've made this analogy between venture capital and philanthropy, the whole sort of notion of venture philanthropy. Well, venture philanthropists are looking for their exit strategy, right? And I find that there are a number of folks, foundation folks and donors, who will say to me, well, I don't want to your point, nonprofits to be dependent on my giving? And, my answer is always like, why not? If they are delivering results toward your shared goals, then focus, like you said, less on dependence and more on being a dependable supporter of those organizations. And the other thing, I'm sorry, I interrupted you before. I realized I didn't really fully address your point about kind of like root causes. And I just want to be really explicit about this, that there is such merit in ending a problem when we can, right? Getting at the root cause, ending polio, really the things we don't have to worry about. We don't worry about our kids getting yellow fever because the Rockefeller Foundation supported the development of a vaccine that made it so that we don't have to worry about that. And that's wonderful. But sometimes folks talk about getting at the root causes as if that's somehow sort of the only thing or superior to dealing with the inevitable reality that no matter how much good work we do on root cause, there will also still be suffering. And so both are really important. Both can be done strategically and effectively, or not so much. And so I say, like, yes, focus on root causes, but also focus on trimming branches.
Yeah. Okay. So that actually makes me think about the question of, do we give now or do we give later? You know, the Community Foundation, we try and help our fund holders no matter where they are along the spectrum. So out of 246 fund holders, they have just two things in common. They love this town and they step up where they can, right?
Yeah.
So they do it though in 246 different ways, which is so exciting and why we love the work. Every day is different. But we have some donors who are committed to deploying the resources during their lifetimes and betting big. So I think of local entrepreneur David Hargrave. He's been hugely successful with Powerhouse as his company, but he's using his success to make big investments in Crowley, where he grew up and where his employees live. He's targeted his support for his church and for key nonprofits that are really moving the needle. And he's even matching employee donations. So that's on one end of the spectrum. And then we have other folks, actually a huge number of families have plans with us beyond their lifetime. And I think of the Wells who are with us today. They're very generous today in their own giving, and then they have plans to keep that going once they have moved on upstairs. So tell us how you help your donors think about that give now, give later question.
Yeah. Well, barring changes in the legal structure, people are free, to make choices about this. And my feeling is that, like most things, the answer is it depends. It depends what you're trying to do, right? And so I actually think there is value, for example, in perpetual foundations, in that there's value in sort of taking the long view, and there can be great value in spending out rapidly. It depends what you're trying to do. I mean, I have a little ongoing debate with one foundation president I'm friendly with. Their foundation is very focused on climate change, which they view and describe as an imminent threat, to life as we know it, and yet the foundation is managed to exist in perpetuity with sort of the lowest legally permissible payout. And I say to him, like, how do you square those two things? Like, if you really think that, shouldn't you be spending out at a higher rate? So then let's talk about this time that we're in. I mean, with all, due sort of humility and respect for the fact that this is not my decision to make, this is individual donors' decisions to make and foundations' decisions to make. I have been arguing that folks should give more now in meaningful ways than they plan to, for all the reasons I said before, that this is the proverbial rainy day, that it's not just raining, it's, pouring, and that that if we don't step up now, there will be vital nonprofits that don't make it. And I have a friend named David Salem who is an investment guy, and he's managed like zillions of dollars for big foundations. And he said to me, and we wrote an op-ed in the Chronicle of Philanthropy recently about this, everybody understands the power of compounding in an investment context, but it applies in a social impact context too. That the nonprofit that has earned trust for decades with a community and is well positioned to serve that community, it's a compounding effectiveness. And if that nonprofit isn't there, we have to start all over to serve that community. And another analogy is, think about, employees and the cost of losing a really tenured, experienced staff member who really knows how to do the job and knows the context, and starting all over. And so for all those reasons, I hope people will really think about and look at the data about what's going on in this country, giving as much as they can in the near term, even if the long-term plan, is to spread, to do giving well into the future. I still think, I would hope you consider stepping up from where you thought you'd be in the next couple of years as we get through this period, which I do think we will get through.
Sure. Well, I'm just mindful of the fact that we want to provide time for a Q&A. It's 2:42. So I want to end on this question about the cycle of good. When I was growing up, my dad used to say, what you do for others will not only come back to you, but it'll come back double. And apparently some smart folks from Notre Dame have also come to the same conclusion. I'd love for you, Phil, to share the findings from Notre Dame's Science of Generosity initiative. I think that'd be a nice note to close on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I referenced that in the conclusion of my book because I had noticed when I was talking to really wonderful nonprofit leaders, and then asking if I could talk to some of the people who those nonprofits had helped, how often, and I talk about one former gang member at the organization that I had mentioned earlier, Ntxcf, and I was having lunch with him and finding out about his life, and he told me his ideal job would be to work at Ntxcf and to give back in the ways that others had helped him, right? I thought, giving really does ripple outward, and kind of giving begets giving. And so I started looking at, is there science behind that? And so the Notre Dame Science of Generosity initiative looked at this, and just to quote from the authors of a book called The Paradox of Generosity, they said, those who give their resources away receive back in turn. In offering our time, money, and energy in service of others' well-being, we enhance our own well-being as well. So they actually studied the relationship between happiness and giving. And they said, in letting go of some of what we own for the good of others, we better secure our own lives too. This paradox of generosity is a sociological fact confirmed by evidence from quantitative surveys and qualitative interviews. So give because you'll be happier. That's the bottom line.
Okay. Well, I think that's a great note on which to wrap up our conversation. Thank you, Phil. Thanks for your great work at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. I encourage everyone, I hope you've got the book, and if you don't, let us know. We'll send you a copy because, to me, this is one of the best investments the Community Foundation can make, because if we all have the best information to work from, and we can give smart, then this town's going to be a whole lot better off. The whole community will. All right. Now with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura McWhorter. She's been taking and recording your questions, and she will facilitate the Q&A period. Laura?
All right. Well, thank you, Rose and Phil, for that great conversation. And I have received some through private chat. So I will start off with the first one for you, Phil. Social services have often been the chosen nonprofits because of the good work and important work that they do. The arts have historically been underfunded, and during these times, they are receiving even less. Our culture, our civilization has been built on the arts. So how do we help our funders better understand that they are at least equally important?
That's a great question. Thank you, Laura, for that. And it's interesting because I don't know if folks are familiar with the whole notion of effective altruism. And this philosopher at Princeton, Peter Singer, who you probably may have heard of, is sort of the, father of this movement, which argues that your giving should be about, where can you have the maximum impact on a person's life, right? And if you take his argument to sort of its logical conclusion, you would give only internationally because your dollars can go further there, and you wouldn't give to the arts. And so I'm not an adherent of that. I think it's an interesting thought experiment and way to challenge yourself, but I believe that arts and culture is just so vital to who we are as people. And it's such an important question right now because arts organizations, like especially if you think about performing arts organizations that rely on fee for service or earned revenue, have been absolutely decimated by COVID because they literally can't open up. And while people have done incredibly creative things, dance performances on Zoom, right? There's only so much that you can do in a virtual world. And when I mentioned that survey back in May that we did, of those who had an earned revenue or fee for service stream, 80% had said that had been negatively affected. And for arts organizations, it's literally been shut off and employees have been furloughed. As you know, there have been tons of job losses. So I just think, in your community, think about what you want that community to look like when this nightmare is over. And, what are the arts and culture organizations in Tarrant County that you want to make sure are there still and are able to thrive, are places where people come together? And that's another thing that's so important, is that these are places where people come together, right? Across all kinds of difference. And if we need anything, in this country, no matter what happens in the next few months, it is that. And they are often, wonderful places for connection, human connection. So think about the ones that matter to you and try to figure out what you can do to support them.
And as you probably know this, Phil, but Tarrant County is just known for its huge commitment to the arts. I mean, between Fort Worth and Arlington, you have incredible institutions and musicians and artists, and it's really a part of our identity that's at risk right now.
Right.
Great. Okay, we have another question here. So you certainly talk about this in the book, and you and Rose have touched on this today, but you talk about unrestricted grants and teaching and trusting nonprofits to use dollars where they are most needed. And we certainly have seen that with our fund holders in the shift with COVID. We saw that in the responses on the poll. But how do you trust nonprofits that they're making wise decisions using my dollars?
It's a good question. I think that once you identify organizations that you believe are doing good work, I think I would argue that if you don't trust them and their leadership enough to allocate your gift, assuming their goals overlap with yours, to allocate your gift as they see best fit, then you don't trust them enough to be supporting them, period. I say that not to be flippant or dismissive of the concern, because I understand it. But this period since mid-March has shown how crucial it is for organizations to be able to use resources to respond to needs that they might not have anticipated the previous day. So I wrote on our blog at cep.org about different nonprofits and what they were doing in the immediate wake of the pandemic. And I'll give you an example. An organization called World Relief Seattle. They work with immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers to help welcome them to the country, to help them find their first jobs. Many of those first jobs are in the hospitality industry. So many of their former clients who had gotten on their feet and had good jobs and were contributing suddenly found themselves and thriving, unemployed. And where did they go when they couldn't put food on the table for their family? They went back to World Relief Seattle, which isn't a food pantry. They went there because they trust the people there, because those are the people who helped them when they first came to the country. And so what did World Relief Seattle do? Well, they repurposed a community garden area that they'd set up to be a distribution location for food in partnership with a major food bank. And they had, and do you want that executive director thinking, oh my gosh, I can't use this donation to support that work because it was restricted for this? If you generally agree with the goals of that organization you support. So I think we do just have to trust that once we've decided what are the organizations that we really believe in, we have to trust those leaders and boards to make the best decisions about how to use those resources. I'm not saying there's never a time to support a project, but organizations are starved for flexible and long-term support because that's what allows them to really strengthen their organizations over time. So if you can provide that, I have spoken to so many nonprofit leaders, and we have literally surveyed tens and tens of thousands of nonprofit leaders. And this is what they need to be more effective. They tell us again and again.
Phil, to chime in on that, actually, I'm happy to hear you mention World Relief. We had a fund here at the Community Foundation, the Better Together Fund, that mobilized, I think there were 77 donors came together and to distribute over $800,000. World Relief was one of the recipients.
Great.
But I'm also mindful, I know Stuart Elkhorn's on the line. He's the chair of the Boys and Girls Club. And I can remember one night, it was too late, but I was on the line with Daphne Barlow, who's the outstanding executive director there. And she suddenly, overnight, became in the food distribution business.
Right.
Because that's what her families needed. And it was
Right.
phenomenal to see the way she pivoted and is now collaborating with a whole bunch of other agencies to provide virtual learning sites. That's amazing to see with the strong organizations, how they really have kind of reconstituted themselves to meet the need.
Yep. Great example.
So let me ask kind of a piggyback question to you, Phil. So if I were to make the gift and I just have a little anxiousness about giving it unrestricted, how do I know the impact that it's giving? I mean, what do you recommend is the best way to communicate with a nonprofit? Or is it to do site visits, be on the board? What is your recommendation to our folks?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the mind shifts that I would suggest is to get away from the idea of knowing the precise isolated impact of your particular dollars and try to get comfortable with knowing that you contributed to the success of an organization, which the organization should be able to describe to you what it is that they accomplished. So in the case of, and I just come back to them so I don't have to come up with a whole other example that I would take time to describe. In the case of UTech, the organization in Lowell that works with Massachusetts that works with gang involved young people, which full disclosure, I have over time also become a donor to. I want to know what the recidivism rate is for the young people, and what percentage of them are employed a year, 5 years out. That's how they judge their success, and I'm good with just knowing that I did something to help contribute to that. I will never know exactly what wouldn't have happened without my X dollars a year, but I'm okay with that. I contributed to something that's effective. They're data driven. They gather good, data and evidence of their efficacy. I don't have to then isolate for my exact causal connection of my resources to their end outcomes.
And I'll refer back to the Lasseters and HS squared. And I know at least once a year, if not more, they'll organize lunches or dinners for the recipients of their program. So they actually are in discussion one-to-one with the final recipient. And I mean, there are cases, I guess, where a nonprofit can cherry pick the people you speak with. But if you were to engage with a cross section of the people that are using the food pantry or participating in the program, and just find the time for a dialogue, I think that can help you feel connected to the work and see the difference you're making.
Yes.
Okay, I've got one final question. We've got about 2 minutes, Phil.
Okay.
So we got a fan, loves your book, says loves your book, read your book. It's a business owner, and he says that you mentioned that nonprofits and businesses are different, but he's kind of challenging you here. Are you really saying that nonprofits can't learn anything from for-profit businesses?
Great question. I'm not saying they can't learn anything from for-profit businesses. I think they can, and I think for-profit businesses can learn something from really effective nonprofits. I guess what I'm arguing is that no sector has a monopoly on effectiveness or excellence. Jim Collins, the business guru, who I think actually really has a good understanding of the nonprofit sector, says, most businesses are mediocre, so why would we want to, import the practices of mediocrity from one sector to the other? I think people say business and what they mean is effective, but if they think about it and they think about their last few customer interactions with businesses, they might say, oh, gee, maybe that's not really a synonym for effective. And I think that the worry is that if we think performance measurement should be as simple for nonprofits as it is for business, then we will do things that are counterproductive in our approach to measurement. Or if we don't understand the way strategy is different and the collaborative context that's different from a competitive dynamic, we will make mistakes in our nonprofit work. But I think organizations can learn from each other across sectors. I do. But I think it's a two-way street.
Laura, one note on that is a friend of mine recently said, the nonprofits are named the wrong thing. It shouldn't be nonprofit. It should be for impact. And if they're for impact, just like businesses are for profit. Nonprofits are here for impact. And I think if we all remember that and make sure we're all holding each other accountable, I think that'll get us down the road.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for answering the questions. I'm going to turn it back over to Vicki, who's going to close us out.
Thank you so much, Phil and Rose. That was just fabulous. And to everyone who was in on the call, we thank you for spending time with us today. Those that work with us on a regular basis, please know that if anything from today has sparked your interest, we would be happy to help you with a giving plan, conversations about your goals and giving. We're only a phone call away. I know Laura would also be thrilled to talk to anyone on the phone that does not already have a fund with us, and we can talk you through that and tell you about our services and how much help we can be for you on that. So we're going to be following up with an email to you about the information from today and a link to this call if you'd like to share it with anyone else. We're also going to share Phil's podcast that he mentioned and his website. There's a lot of great information on there for you. And his podcast is very helpful and really just about the book. If you've ordered the book, and I hope you have taken the opportunity to accept that gift from us, if you've already ordered it, please know it's in the mail, and we hope that you enjoy it. Our time is up. I think we're right on time. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Rose. Thank you for everyone in attendance. And hope you have a lovely day. That's it.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Oh, I forgot this.
That's okay.
Sorry. If you're still on the call, look at the slide.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Good to see you all.
Take care.
Great
Thank
job.
you.
Thank
So
you.
join us January 28th. We're going to have another event called Rebounding After a Year in Crisis. So mark your calendars and you'll receive your invitation via email.
Yeah, John Robinson and Pete Guerin will be with us, so that'll be fun.
Yeah, sorry I forgot that. Thanks.